A Hollywood director's shout, a moment of terror, and an act of understanding that crossed enemy lines. It was a sound wholly misunderstood, leading to a moment of frozen panic. This is the story of the German POWs who mistook a movie set for a battlefield and the surprising bridge that was built in the middle of a war. In 1944, the United States was holding over 400,000 German prisoners of war, but not all of them were sent to stockades in Texas. 22-year-old Klaus Hartmann, a drafted film student, was sent somewhere else entirely. He was sent to Hollywood. The light was brighter than anything he had ever seen, a relentless artificial sun that baked the air and smelled of hot metal and sawdust. He shielded his eyes not from a desert but from the massive silvered reflectors of a California movie studio. Just like Texas, California faced a massive labor shortage. With millions of young men overseas, the state's engines of agriculture and industry were desperate for manpower, and in Los Angeles, prisoners like Klaus were assigned to the most bizarre workplace of all. This was Hollywood. To his left, a towering fake facade of a French village leaned on crude wooden braces, its paint peeling to reveal fresh pine. To his right, men dressed as Roman centurions smoked cigarettes next to a plywood and plaster sphinx. Thick black cables snaked through the dust. The air was a bizarre mix of horse manure from a nearby western set, the sharp tang of fresh paint, and the faint sweet smell of a commissary kitchen. Back home, propaganda broadcasts had painted this place as a den of degenerate art, the very soul of a corrupt America. Klaus expected cruelty, a cage, and the ever-present threat of violence. He had been told Americans were barbarians with machines, but the guards here didn't shout. They looked bored. They were older men, reservists in ill-fitting uniforms, chewing gum and leaning on their rifles with a lazy, casual indifference. They looked more like sleepy night watchmen than the monsters from the posters. The prisoners' khaki uniforms stamped with PW on the back drew no more attention than a carpenter's overalls. This wasn't cruelty. This was just work. It was a business. An American officer holding only a clipboard pointed toward a building so enormous it seemed to block out the sky. "All right, you fellas, this way, stage 12. The heavy doors rolled open with a low groan, parting to reveal a cavernous, cathedral-like darkness inside. The prisoners stepped from the blinding sun into the cool, silent dark. Their boots echoed on the vast wooden floor as the heavy doors rumbled shut behind them. For a moment, they were blind, suspended in a void that smelled of old wood and paint, unsure if they had entered a workshop or a prison, or perhaps, in this strange land, both. They shuffled forward, hands closely clasped behind their backs. Klaus had been taught that Hollywood was a weapon of American propaganda, a tool designed to spread decadent ideas. He was about to find out he was half right. It wasn't a weapon of ideas, but a weapon of production. The prisoners hadn't been brought to Soundstage 12 to be punished or even to be re-educated. They were there for a reason that was far more American: efficiency. Their job was simple: brute force labor. Moving heavy lights, hauling bags of sand, painting the massive canvas flats that would become a French sky or a New York street. The propaganda Klaus had absorbed was potent. He expected starvation and humiliation. The reality was bookkeeping. The United States, following the Geneva Conventions with obsessive precision, had turned its prisoner program into a vast, efficient business. The men were fed well, often better than their own families back in Germany. They were housed in clean barracks. They were even paid for their labor, 80 cents a day, paid in camp script. This script could be used at the camp canteen for American luxuries like Coca-Cola, cigarettes, or magazines filled with pictures of movie stars, the very people they were now working for. This wasn't kindness, not in the way Klaus understood it. It was logistics. It was the same industrial might that built bombers and Liberty ships now applied to human management. The studio didn't see Klaus Hartmann as an enemy soldier to be broken. It saw him as man-hour, general labor, 80 cents. The Americans' attitude wasn't compassion. It was a strange, business-like indifference. They were not hated. They were just managed. This was the true shock. The Americans didn't seem to possess the ideological fury that the Germans had been taught was essential to war. They simply processed them, Klaus realized the American war machine and the American dream machine were one and the same. They ran on the same fuel, endless resources, unshakable confidence, and an absolute obsession with efficiency. The POWs weren't prisoners in a brutal camp. They were the lowest-rung employees in the world's most powerful fantasy factory. They were about to learn that in this strange land, the only thing more powerful than an army general was the man who ran the set, a man who ruled this world with an iron fist. The air in Soundstage 12 crackled with artificial gunfire. They were filming a chaotic recreation of a French battlefield, a scene of a war the prisoners had just been pulled from. And the man in charge wasn't a general. He was a director named Sam Whitaker, and he was a tyrant. He prowled the set with the restless energy of a man burning daylight, wearing tan khaki pants, scuffed riding boots, and a pale blue shirt sweated dark at the collar. Around his neck, on a worn leather strap, hung a viewfinder, which he raised to his eye constantly. Klaus, assigned to help move a breakaway wall, watched him. Within 5 minutes, Klaus watched him berate a starlet for being late, tell a lighting technician his work was fit for a funeral, and argue with a man in a suit who he simply called finance. Whitaker's voice bypassed conversation and went straight to a roar. The scene erupted. American GI actors charged a plywood farmhouse, smoke billowed, prop guns chattered, but the scene was falling apart. A young actor, meant to react to a simulated blast, mistimed his movement and stumbled. Sam Whitaker slammed his hand against a wooden crate. "No, no, no, he's early! Again! Reset!" The actors, sweating under the intense heat, walked back to their marks. This distinction, however, was lost on the German prisoners. They came from a world of rigid, brutal hierarchy. They could not tell the difference between movie set stress and the dangerous anger of a commandant. To them, Sam Whitaker, with his loud commands and flailing arms, was the absolute ruler of this strange, dark kingdom. Klaus, the film student, recognized the type, the genius director, who ruled through creative fury. But in Berlin, that fury was about art. Here, surrounded by armed guards, that same fury felt infinitely more perilous. The prisoners responded with the only defense they knew. They became invisible, their movements swift and silent, trying to remain unseen, their eyes downcast, learning to anticipate the director's movements like prey tracking a predator. Every shout, even for lights, made them jump. "Action!" Sam roared again. This time a prop rifle jammed. The actor pulling the trigger looked down at it, his face a mask of confusion breaking the entire illusion. The firing pin clicked uselessly. "Oh, for the love of—" Sam let out a groan of pure frustration. Klaus watched him, frozen. This was not just artistic anger. Every minute wasted on a Hollywood set cost thousands of dollars. But more than that, Sam was losing the light. That precise, fragile balance of artificial sun that made the scene look real. He was a man chasing a vision, and he would let nothing get in his way. Klaus saw Sam's face, slick with sweat, turn a deep red. The director paced in a tight circle, his hands clenching and unclenching. He kicked a stray sandbag, sending a puff of dust into the air. "One more time," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And if you miss the mark, so help me." They ran the scene a third time. For a moment it was perfect. The charge was good, the smoke was right. Then the lead actor hesitated. He looked half a second too late at the spot where the special effect was meant to go. It was the final straw. It was an unforgivable delay. Sam Whitaker's entire body went rigid. He threw his rolled-up script to the sawdust-covered floor. He filled his lungs, his face contorted in a mask of pure, primal fury. It was a single, primal roar that ripped through the chatter of the prop guns and the yells of the actors. A word so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the soundstage. Cut! For a single long second, the only sound on Soundstage 12 was the echo of Sam Whitaker's voice. It hung in the air, sharp and metallic, then came the clatter of heavy pine, followed by a muffled thud. The sound of the shout had not even faded before Klaus Hartmann and the 2 other prisoners reacted. It was not a conscious decision. It was not a flinch, or a duck, or a simple startle. It was a violent, full-body, trained reaction, a reflex burned into their nervous systems by years of war, a response that bypassed all thought. In the instant the roar hit them, they dove for cover. They let go of the heavy wall brace, it crashed to the floor, gouging the wood, and in the same unified motion they threw themselves flat onto the sawdust-covered planks. Their hands laced behind their heads, elbows tucked in, faces pressed hard against the floor. They made themselves as small, as flat as possible. This was the posture of survival, the shape a man takes when he is bracing for an explosion or the impact of a boot or the cold judgment of a rifle. The set, a moment before a cacophony of artificial war, went utterly silent. The prop gunfire stopped. The actors, frozen mid-stride, lowered their prop rifles. Cameramen instinctively lifted their heads from their viewfinders, their faces blank with confusion. Electricians high up on the metal gantries peered down into the pool of light, trying to understand what they were seeing. The entire production, a machine of 100 moving parts, had frozen in place. Everyone stared. The only movement was a thin tendril of chemical smoke rising from a machine, its acrid smell suddenly sharp in the quiet. Dust motes danced in the beams of the hot lights. Even Sam Whitaker was stunned speechless. His arm was still raised, his mouth half open, the echo of his own fury still ringing in his ears. He stared at the 3 khaki uniforms, 3 men pressed into the floor as if trying to merge with the earth itself. This was the tableau. 100 people in a fake French village, in the middle of a fake war, staring at 3 men who were suddenly, terrifyingly, real. Klaus's heart hammered against the floorboards, a frantic drumbeat against the wood. His ears rang, not from the prop gun fire, but from the sudden, terrible silence. He wasn't on a soundstage in California. He was back in the Ardennes, his face pressed into the frozen mud, the smell of pine and cold steel in his nostrils, waiting for the real artillery shell to land. He tasted sawdust and fear. He squeezed his eyes shut, every muscle in his body locked rigid, bracing for the schlag. The blow, the kick from a steel-toed boot. He could almost feel the phantom impact. This is what happened. This was the universal language of war. A command that loud, a roar of pure animalistic fury from a superior officer was always followed by punishment. They had broken the rule. They had drop-decked the heavy wall. They had ruined the scene, the expensive, precious scene. He could feel the cold sweat gathering on his neck, but the blow did not come. The silence stretched, becoming heavier and more confusing with every passing second. Out in the darkness, the American crew was utterly baffled. Klaus could hear them whispering, their voices laced with concern, not anger. "What's wrong with them?" one voice asked. "Are they sick?" another wondered. "Maybe the smoke," someone offered weakly. They were electricians and carpenters, men who understood circuits and lumber, and they were seeing a level of terror that had no place on a call sheet. The nearby American MP, a young man from Ohio, took a hesitant step forward. He nudged one of the men on the floor with his boot, a gesture that was almost gentle. "Hey," the guard asked nervously, You okay?" Then, the heavy, confident footsteps of Sam Whitaker cut through the whispers. Klaus heard the creak of the floorboards as the director strode into the center of the set. The footsteps stopped, just inches from Klaus's head. Klaus could feel the man's shadow falling over him, blocking out the heat of the Klieg lights. He smelled the faint, expensive scent of the director's cigar. He waited. He heard Sam let out a long, slow breath, a sound not of anger, but of sheer, profound disbelief. "What in the blue hell," Sam Whitaker said, his voice baffled, "are you doing?" The question hung in the air, a perfect, logical American question, but Klaus could not answer. He was still a prisoner, trapped in a memory that the director could not possibly understand. He was frozen in a past terror. "Get up," Sam said, his voice no longer a roar but a low, confused growl. Slowly, trembling, Klaus Hartmann pushed himself up from the floor. He stood at a strange, half-crouched angle, as if still expecting a blow. The other 2 prisoners remained on the ground, too terrified to move. "Get up," Sam repeated, gesturing for all of them to stand. They rose, their faces pale, their eyes wide and fixed on the director. Sam pointed a finger at Klaus. "Now, you talk. What was that?" Klaus's mind raced, but his English, learned in a formal Berlin classroom, was not built for this moment. He couldn't find the words for trauma, for conditioning, for war. He gestured weakly from his own face to Sam's. The shout, sir." His voice was a dry whisper. "The anger." Sam let out a short, exasperated laugh, a sound of pure disbelief. He threw his hands in the air. The shout? Anger? That's called directing, son. I'm a director, I shout. That's the job. He turned to the crew as if looking for an ally. We're losing the light. I've got a prima donna in boots who can't hit a mark, and I shout. So what? He turned back to Klaus, his face a mask of impatience. You cost me a take. You dropped a flat. You don't do that again. No, sir, Klaus stammered, shaking his head. He knew he was failing to explain. In Germany, a shout. So loud. He pointed to Sam's face. From a Führer. It means... He stopped, unable to finish. He just stood there, a picture of helpless fear. Then, a quiet voice cut through the tension. Mr. Whitaker. A woman stepped forward from the shadows behind the camera. She was older, in her 50s, holding a thick script and a pencil. It was Ilse, the script supervisor, a woman known for her meticulous notes and her quiet, precise German-Jewish accent. She was a refugee from Berlin, a veteran of the same UFA studios Klaus had attended, though she never spoke of it. She walked calmly between the director and the prisoner. She looked at Klaus, spoke a single, gentle sentence in German, and he nodded, his eyes filling with a sudden, sharp relief. She turned back to Sam. He says, sir. He apologizes. He did not understand. Sam grunted, crossing his arms. Understand what? It's a movie set, not a... Ilse held up her hand, a small brave gesture that silenced the director. You must understand, she said, her voice soft but firm. Where he comes from, where we come from, when a man in uniform shouts with that much anger, it is not to stop the action. She took a breath. It is to begin it. It is the sound that comes before the punishment. They thought you were going to hit them. Sam Whitaker looked from the translator to the terrified prisoner, then across his plywood and paint battlefield. For the first time, the loudest man in Hollywood was completely silent. The words, "They thought you were going to hit them," hung in the air. He stared at Klaus, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a laborer, not as a PW, but as a young man whose world had been so defined by brutality that a human shout was processed as a physical threat. He saw the genuine, unfeigned terror in the young man's eyes. Sam was a tyrant, but a tyrant of art. His rage was about a missed mark, a bad line reading. It was the passion of creation. In that instant, he was confronted with the horrifying inverse, a system where the shout was a tool of destruction. The gap between them was suddenly vast. It wasn't just an ocean or a language barrier, it was a moral chasm. Sam, the brash, confident American, had always seen his anger as a tool. He had just been shown that to others it was a weapon. He felt a hot, unfamiliar flush creep up his neck. It was a shame. It was the deep, unsettling embarrassment of a man who, in his own kingdom, had been mistaken for the very monsters his country was fighting. He had used his power, and this was the result. He looked at the actors in their fake, clean uniforms, and at Klaus in his real, sweat-stained one, and the entire artifice of the day felt cheap. He couldn't apologize. It wasn't in his nature. He couldn't go on. The illusion was shattered. He let out a long, slow breath. He jammed his hands deep into his pockets. He turned to the crew, his voice suddenly quiet, flat, and unrecognizable. All right, that's a wrap for the day. Everyone, go home. A murmur of disbelief went through the set. To stop filming mid-afternoon was to burn thousands of dollars. But one look at Sam's face, a mask of grim finality, and no one argued. The lights began to click off. Sam Whitaker turned and walked off the set, pushing into the blinding, indifferent California sun. Klaus was left standing in the growing dark, his muscles still aching. He had expected a blow. He had expected to be taken away. Instead, the commandant had simply left. He had stopped the war. He had received nothing. This, more than any shout, was the most bewildering thing of all. The next morning, the prisoners were marched back to Soundstage 12. The air was thick with an anxious, heavy silence. Klaus Hartmann kept his eyes on the floor, certain that today the punishment they had avoided would finally arrive. The rest of the crew, drinking coffee from paper cups, were gathered in the center of the set, their usual morning chatter reduced to quiet murmurs. They all looked towards Sam Whitaker, who stood by the massive camera dolly with a strange, contemplative stillness. He was holding something small and metal in his hand. "All right, gather round," Sam said. His voice was not a roar. It was a normal, conversational tone, and the effect was immediate. Everyone, including the prisoners, snapped to attention. "We're making a change," Sam announced, holding up the object in his hand. It was a simple, silver-colored coach's whistle, dangling from a plain black cord. "We lost half a day yesterday because I was blowing my stack. That's inefficient. It's unprofessional." He looked directly at Klaus Hartmann. "From now on," he said, "we don't yell. We're professionals." He put the whistle to his lips and blew a single, sharp, clean blast. Fweet. One whistle means action. He then blew two short, crisp notes. Fwee, fweet. Two whistles means cut. Simple. Got it? Good. Let's make a movie. And just like that, the tension broke. The crew, with that remarkable American adaptability, just nodded and went back to their stations. The machine, broken by emotion, was now fixed with pure, simple practicality. But the real change came an hour later. Klaus was moving a sandbag when Sam Whitaker approached him. "You're the film student," Sam stated. Klaus, startled, just nodded. "Yes, sir. From UFA, in Berlin." Sam grunted, his eyes appraising Klaus. "UFA, huh? You know Fritz Lang's work? Metropolis?" Klaus's eyes widened. "Yes, of course, sir. The use of light, of shadow." Sam nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah, the shadows." He gestured with his thumb toward the camera. "My loader, a kid named Jimmy, he's green. He keeps mislabeling the canisters. It's driving me nuts. You know how to load a Mitchell camera magazine?" Klaus was stunned. "Yes, sir, I have done it many times." Sam clapped him on the shoulder, a single, hard pat. "Good. You're not hauling sand anymore. You're with him. Don't mess it up." It was a bridge built not of flags or sentiment, but of the shared universal language of their craft. As Klaus walked toward the camera, he was no longer just a prisoner. He was a filmmaker, and the silent, angry commandant had just become his director. This was a new understanding. When Klaus Hartmann returned to Berlin in 1946, he found his city and his film studios in a universe of rubble. The grand UFA soundstages, once the pride of European cinema, were skeletal frames, their walls blasted open to the gray winter sky. He stood where he had once learned his craft and saw only devastation. The air smelled of damp plaster and cold ash. It was a bitter homecoming. It was the ultimate tragic set, a world unmade. But amidst the ruins of his homeland, Klaus carried something that could not be broken: the technical skills he had honed on an American movie set, and the memory of a director who had, in his own gruff way, treated him with respect. He began to work, helping to salvage what he could from the wreckage. His knowledge, sharpened by Sam Whitaker's demanding fast-paced efficiency, was invaluable. He understood the American cameras, the American lighting techniques, the American method of pragmatic, relentless production. He rose quickly, becoming a key figure in what the world would come to call tremor film, or rubble film, a new raw kind of cinema that turned the very devastation around him into a powerful, honest art. He was helping to build a new story from the old. Years passed. The rubble was cleared. Germany and its film industry was reborn. In 1960, Klaus Hartmann, now a celebrated director, stood on the stage at the Berlin Film Festival. His new film was being hailed as a masterpiece of the new wave. At the crowded reception afterward, a voice, older now but still carrying a familiar gravel, cut through the applause. "Not bad, kid. You finally learned how to hold a shadow." Klaus turned. Leaning on a cane, his eyes squinted in that old, appraising way, was Sam Whitaker. They stood for a moment, the German master and the retired American tyrant, two men who had last met across a divide of war and barbed wire. Then Sam smiled, and they embraced. Later, a young journalist asked Klaus, "Herr Hartmann, what was the most important lesson you ever learned as a filmmaker?" The room expected an answer about light or actors. Klaus looked across the room at Sam, who was quietly watching. I learned it as a prisoner, Klaus said, his voice steady. From Mr. Whitaker. He taught me that how you make the movie is as important as the movie you make. Before Sam left that night, he pressed something into Klaus's hand. It was heavy, brass, and worn smooth, his old director's viewfinder. You earned this, Sam grunted. You always saw the shot. Klaus held it, the metal cool against his palm, a simple tool that had become a symbol of a profound truth. The greatest act of direction on that Hollywood set had never been captured on film. It was a single, human choice. To replace a roar of fear with the simple, clear sound of a whistle. A single whistle that changed everything. It proved that even in the middle of a world war, our shared craft and our shared humanity can be the most powerful sound of all. A lesson in compassion, learned in the most unlikely of places. Thanks for watching.